Welcome to the Creative Ticket podcast, brought to you by Pacific Video. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast has been originally created, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today. I am Geraldo Rodriguez, Sydney-based actor, writer, and director, and on this podcast I'll talk to artists from all over the world about their craft, their careers, inspirations, and insights. If you are an arts fanatic like myself, make sure to follow and subscribe so you won't miss out on new episodes. Phyllis Foundis is a writer, TEDx speaker, producer, performer, and multi-award-winning TV and radio host. She wrote the books The Joy of Sex and The Virgin Club, which was also a comedic theatre show performed in Australia and overseas at the Edinburgh Festival and also in London. She's the host of Love Soul, radio show that airs on Sundays, 2 p.m. on Eastside Radio, and she has recently performed in A Little Bit of Lip, an incredible one-woman show directed by Sarah Jane Starr. Welcome to the Creative Ticket. It's an honor to have you on the show, Phyllis. Thank you so much.
What a pleasure, Geraldo. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to start with the recent success of A Little Bit of Lip, which is an incredibly honest and funny show. How did the idea of doing such a show came about?
Well, the last time I did a show was about 20 years ago. So that whole idea of getting up on stage and telling stories that are quite personal and intimate to me is not a foreign concept. And when I knew that the festival, the Sydney Fringe Festival, which I'd never done before, it had a deadline of signing up. I think it was May or April of this year. And I remember sitting at my keyboard going, should I do it? Am I going to do it? And then I just said yes, and I applied. I just thought over the last year I've kept a weekly blog called My Philosophy, so PHYLOSOPHY. And actually, I was going to add you to it today because I literally just sent it out, but I might just forward one on to you. And so I thought at the beginning when I signed up in April to do the Fringe Festival that my show was going to be about an edited version of all these blogs that I've been sending out over the last year, which is I promote those as about love, life, and all the glitter in between, right? That's what I thought. And then the more I sat with the idea of being a part of the festival, the more I realized that, and I went through all of my stories in this blog over the last 12 months, and I thought, you know what? It felt to me like it was going to be a culmination of everything I've experienced in the last, I want to say 6 years of my life. And then I just thought it's going to be a little bit of lip. That.
And how is it for you to share such honestly and transparently about the things you went through throughout those years? Is it something you're used to doing as a writer, or is it something that you thought it's a new challenge, it's a new sort of challenge?
I didn't realize how confronting it was going to be until I sat down with my director, Sarah Jane, about a month before, and she helped me shape the flow of stories. So, and it was all on these kind of colourful cards, and I'd colour-coded them: life, marriage, love, parenting, caregiving. And I always gravitate to work that's very personal. So whether it's, I love autobiographical works. So I love reading about people's lives. When I sit down to watch a movie, if it's something that's based on reality, I love it even more. If it's a documentary about someone's process, I adore that kind of storytelling and that kind of art. So as an artist, it feels really natural to me to want to express myself in a very personal way. And it's not for the faint-hearted. I didn't realize it was going to be as confronting as it was, because I had to, with Sarah Jane's assistance, I had to tease out stories that are really personal to me and personal to my sons and personal to my boy's father as well. It was confronting. But, as they say, it's a bit of a wank, but it was a very cathartic, and it felt like everything was leading up to this one point of telling these stories on stage.
And was it different depending on who was in the audience?
Fabulous question, Geraldo. Yes, because I found, so on the first night, which was opening night, and we'd sold out, so we had about 50 people in that audience, which I love. And the love that I was feeling back from the audience, lots of friends were in that crowd, felt electric, and I was floating. That's the best way that I can describe that experience. Saturday night, the second night, and I was quite emotional because I talk about my father's passing and my elderly mother and the dissolving of my marriage and how that's affected me and my children. The second night, the audience was different again. The dynamic had flipped and they weren't reacting in the same way. It wasn't bad, it was just different. And I was thrown and I felt off during that performance. Did you come on the second night or the third?
Third night. Okay. On Sunday.
Okay. So the final night was the night where my mother was in the audience and my boy's father. And he'd already seen the stuff I was going to be discussing. So he'd given me his blessing. And the boys knew what I was going to be discussing from day one. And the boys were there every night. But that final night, I don't know if you recall, but there were moments where I was telling the same stories and I was sobbing. And I had to stop. I had to stop to gather myself because he was in the audience and my mother was in the audience. And it just changed the dynamic of that storytelling experience completely.
And for you, what was the most magical or awkward moment performing on those 3 days?
The most magical. It was, from the outside looking in, it was magical when I had my very first standing ovation on the second night. But because I was feeling so off during that whole performance, I couldn't receive it. It was the strangest sensation, Geraldo, because we all think as performers, people that are on stage, to get that moment is what we all strive for, And you've seen it in the movies and you've gone to shows and people have stood up and, oh my goodness, to feel this. And it was completely different. I was like, what is this? What do I do with it? But didn't you just see that performance? Did you? Anyway, so that was that. So that could have been interpreted as magical. The real magic for me came when I saw my sons doing their thing on stage and then introducing me, and then we had that moment together. That was magic. Lots of magic. I'm going to describe another one. On the night that you were there, every night I'd ask for someone to come from the audience to share a story with me with Elle, who you see in the background. The first 2 nights, Australian audiences are very different. We're not very demonstrative. We just want to take things in. We're a little bit apologetic like that, which I find very annoying. But so I was kind of used to that. Mostly people coming up on stage were people that I knew. The third night, there was a gentleman on my right who'd come with my agent, and I'd never met him before. And he was responding in a very loud and passionate way, which I loved. And then he was fine to come up on stage. And the magic came when he was suddenly sharing things in a very vulnerable way, in a very honest and transparent way. And for that portion of the show, it was absolutely magical. Absolutely magical.
I agree. I will never forget that interview when he came on stage and talked to you and told about his life too. an audience of
Yeah.
complete strangers, which was very vulnerable and but at the same time
Yeah.
very safe. Because I think the way you were vulnerable allowed everyone else to feel that they were safe in that environment. It was magical. It was really, really incredible.
Thanks.
You talk about your father on the show. You talk about your father and his experience and how he was such a wonderful storyteller. Do you think that not only inspired you, influenced you, but also shaped the way you look, not only to stories, but also to people in general?
100%. Yes. My father, I think, was very progressive for a relatively traditional Greek man. So, I mean, he was born in 1930 and he migrated out to Australia in I want to say the 50s. And he lived a very exciting and interesting and unusual life before he met my mother again in Sydney. So he was a musician. He was playing in all these Latin American clubs in Sydney and having wild and exciting affairs with all sorts of visiting exotic dancers from America. And he had this ability to be very accepting of lots of different kinds of people. You know, people that today we tick those diversity boxes, you know, gay, straight, in between, you know, black, white. It made no difference to my father because that's the world that he was living in when he was playing music around Sydney back in the 50s. And so when he started to drive his taxi and he was, again, being exposed to a lot of different walks of life, for him it was not such a big leap of understanding or of acceptance. And so that, I think, sharpened his ability to connect to people and not be afraid of... a couple of times I'd be riding in the taxi with him and he'd pick up a passenger and he'd ask them the most outrageously personal questions, and people would just respond and tell him their stories. And so I think that ability, back then I didn't realize that's what he was doing or that he had a gift, like I mentioned in my show, but it was only when he left us that I realized, yeah. And I love doing the same thing that he does. I love asking outlandish questions of people. And, you know, the bottom line is, if you don't want to answer them, just say, I'm not comfortable answering that question. But if you are comfortable, suddenly we have this incredible moment of intimacy and sharing and connection that I think is missing a lot in the world.
And for you, is that a source of wealth in the sense that when you're able to share and to listen and to be interested in those different stories, does that make you richer, you find?
That's a fantastic way of phrasing that question. Absolutely. And that's where the wealth lies. And it's interesting that you use that term because my father was not a wealthy man. He did not own lots of property. He owned a silly old secondhand car. He always said to me, you know, I wish I had more money to buy you the car. I wish I, you know, could have taken you away on all these holidays. But my father's wealth was in his ability to connect to people. And so absolutely, when I hear people's stories, and I've interviewed a lot of people over the last few years, that moment where someone that you would not expect is sharing a really incredible, intimate and very vulnerable story with you, it is priceless. Absolutely priceless.
Amazing. Another question still regarding those roots. Your father was born in Greece. Your mother was born in Egypt.
Actually, Dad was born in Egypt. And Geraldo, I'm just going to pause you for a minute because my battery is about to run out on my laptop. I'm going to get my charger. I'm going to plug it right in. So just hold that thought. Hold that thought. Okay.
That's all right.
Hang on.
Sure.
Hang on. You can see my pajamas and everything.
That's all right. I can edit this part out.
Edit the pajamas out. Although they're nice pajamas, you know, they're covered in scars.
I might leave this part then.
Hang on. Okay. I'm hoping that we can just do this. It might look a little bit different, but no, it's okay. You still see L.
That's
And my
perfect.
washing. So let me script the washing. How's that for unscripted?
That's completely fine. I can edit it
Okay,
out.
good. Nope. Jeez.
Um,
Hang on. Can you ask me that again? Okay. I've got a little light here as well.
oh,
Yes.
nice.
Okay, there we go.
And what I meant to ask you is, so your father was actually born in Egypt, but from a Greek
Yes.
background,
Yeah.
same as your mother, right? And having parents that were born overseas and came to Australia, and growing up in Australia, which is a multicultural society, does that make you more aware of cultural differences and more interested in different perspectives?
Yes and no. I think um, I've always I don't know anything different. I was raised as a Greek Australian, woman, girl. My mother was very adamant that I speak Greek at home and only Greek, and English was not allowed. So that developed a real pride in my language, and I was able to communicate very intelligently with my Greek peers when I went to Greece for the first time. So that was really cool. So I thank her for that. But it's not something that has inspired a greater passion for speaking with people of different sort of cultures. I think it's just, people are people. I don't care that you speak Greek or you're from, Brazil. Stories, I think, transcend culture.
Amazing. Shifting a little bit to your writer career, you've written for stage, you've written for performing, you've written for readers. When you write, do you have a specific reader in mind?
Um, Depends on the topic that I'm writing about. In Joy of Sags, I was obviously writing for women because I was exploring the topic of female sexuality and what happens to us beyond a certain age, certainly in a youth obsessed world, and from a physical point of view as well. But I think the common denominator with all the audiences that I write for is that desire for truth telling, and that desire, actually no, even beyond truth telling, that desire to connect with intimate content.
Amazing. In The Joy of Sex, obviously you talk about the joy of sex, and you bring a mixture of scientific facts, philosophy, history, actual stories, true stories from people that you talked to. Why do you think in 2024 sex is still such a taboo to talk and actually to study
Yeah.
about?
So the book itself is not, it may seem on the surface like it is about sex, but it actually isn't. And anyone, I'm not talking about you specifically, but anyone who thinks that book is ostensibly about sex has spectacularly missed the point, because it is about, it's about sexuality, sure, but it's also about that connection that you have with yourself as a woman, as a sexual being, I guess. But what was the question? You've thrown me.
if studying about facts and rituals, or actually the self-knowledge required to have a happy sex life, whether it's with someone else or whether it's
Right.
with yourself, why studying about that
Is it still
is
taboo?
still such
Yeah.
a mystery
Yeah.
thing.
I don't know why it's such a. I think there is still a certain amount of, stigma. It feels to me like we can't have a conversation about sexuality or orgasms or sensuality, whether it's to do with the relationship that you have with yourself or with others, without going, talking about this, and without sensationalizing it, without turning it into something that should inspire shame. I don't understand that. And what's interesting is that it's okay for us to watch explicit violence in movies and listen to it in songs and in any other art form. But the minute we start to explore sex and sexuality, suddenly it is something that needs to be policed and kept away from people. I don't understand it.
Do you think that's related to an intention or a need to sort of tame a desire or to control the desire that is natural between
I think it's
people?
control. Absolutely. I think it's control. And if you look at it from a female perspective, and I talk about this a lot in my book, The Joy of Sags, for a very long time, a woman's orgasmic tendencies was pathologized. And what basically that meant was that if a woman was feeling a certain kind of way in Victorian times, they put it down to the fact that she needed to go and have an orgasm, which they called an hysterical paroxysm. And you would go into a doctor's office and he would basically take you to that point. And the doctor had this long queue outside of his clinic because all these women were lining up, and a movie was made about it, and it's called Hysteria. Came out, I think, about 10 or so years ago. And if that's what would cure you, suddenly you were labeled a nymphomaniac. There are these horrific stories which I researched. There was a doctor that was practicing in the 1800s in Sydney, I believe, and then he moved to Melbourne, where he would excise or burn off a woman's clitoris because there was something wrong with her if that's all she wanted to do and all she wanted to feel. So, yeah, this idea that a woman's power was seen as threatening, the power that she had to feel this transcendent emotion, this transcendent feeling, was a great threat to men of a certain era. It was, so power is, something that we don't understand, that we are afraid of, we want to squash.
And your book, you have you talk to people that women that have reached a certain self-knowledge, a certain wisdom about themselves. Do you think nowadays people are getting to that point earlier, or does it take time for each human being to be self-aware enough and confident enough to exercise their sexuality in a more honest and confident way?
I think it depends on the woman. It depends on the experiences that you've had. I think generally, and again, this is generally speaking, a woman doesn't really come into her own, I don't think, until she's in her maybe late 30s and into her 40s and 50s and beyond. And I like to describe it like a woman in her 20s has got this incredibly high performance sports car, but she doesn't quite know how to handle it until she reaches a certain age where she's very comfortable with who she is. She's not afraid to be who she is, and therefore knows exactly what will give her pleasure physically, emotionally, spiritually. And yeah, we are like a high performance race car, Geraldo. So I like to use that analogy.
I once heard someone say, "Youth is incredible. It's a shame it's wasted on young
100%. I love that
people."
expression. Youth is wasted on the young. Yes, indeed. I was thinking the other day, what would happen? I don't know how old you are, Geraldo. How old are you? Oh,
40.
spring chicken. When you look at the life experience and the intellectual capital and the emotional capital that you and I have, imagine transferring all of this knowledge into our 20-something-year-old bodies. Oh my goodness, can you imagine? That would just be, you've got all this knowledge and you've got all this experience, and you're like, now I'm going to do life a little bit differently. I've got a different body. It's a younger body. It's a more vital body, all these things. But that's not how life is set up. I think like in our 20s, it's very much about finding out who we are, and we just happen to have, what we lack in emotional and intellectual experience, we make up for in our physicality, and then it's the opposite once we get into our 40s and 50s and beyond. Interesting.
And I used to have a drama teacher. He used to say that it takes a lot of courage to grow old. Do you feel like just growing old takes that toll on our courage? Does it make us braver to grow old?
Great, I love that. I think we can go one of two ways. You can get braver the older you get, or you just completely rebel against this idea that you're getting older and more frail, and you've got to be more calculating in the steps that you take, and so you kind of shrink back. Or there are those of us who just say, no, I'm going to be even braver, because what's the alternative to not? Maybe we feel, I'll tell you this, I think the older I'm getting, the more courageous I want to be, the more courageous I need to be, so I can feel as young as possible for as long as possible. Because I think bravery comes with being young. Because remember when we were in our 20s, and I see that with my teenagers, they are invincible because they don't have, the concept, even though my eldest son particularly is talking a lot about aging, and he said, I don't understand how I'll feel when I look in the mirror and I see an old man staring back. They don't have they're not as close to aging as we are, so they don't have a concept of what that's like. Therefore, they are that informs, their choices a lot, I think.
And on your show, you talk about being present in the moment. And on your TED Talk,
have you seen it?
You showed a quote.
Oh, good.
Yes, I loved it. And you show a quote from William Booth, which goes like, "The greatness of a man's or a woman's power is the measure of his or their surrender."
Yeah.
What does surrender mean to you?
Let go and let God. And it's the hardest thing to do, because especially if you're a control freak, and you just want to try and make things happen and force things into being and make sure that you've got the right people around you and the right situations and you're making the right calls. And I think with aging, what I've found and what I'm delighted with is that you just start to care less, and you are in a state or in a stage of your life where it's more conducive to just let go. And many times, I'm very ambitious. I'm very driven. When I see a goal, I chase it and I chase it until I run out of breath. But what I'm also finding at the same time, and this is, the paradox of life, I guess, or getting older, I find that it's like, it's okay, just relax, they are, and I've always thought this, they either like me or they don't. They either want me or they won't. This idea of just pushing and pushing, the older I get, the less inclined I am to do that. I'm more about, I heard this great thing the other day. If you want to fall in love, create a beautiful garden. No, if you want to attract, it was about love. If you want to attract the bees to your garden, create a beautiful garden and let the bees come to you. Don't go chasing those damn bees because you'll never catch them. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And shifting a little bit to the ambition and to the driven part, which is essential on a performer's or an artist's career. How do you go about your career in terms of like a professional development, or do you work on your craft, whether it's a writer or a performer, and let the rest come as it may, or do you put all the focus you can on creating new things, coming up with new ideas for shows, for books, for texts that you want to share? How do you balance those two aspects, or is it the same thing for you?
Ideas come to me really. I get a lot of ideas all the time, and the challenge for me is to try and slow that down a little bit, so that I can focus on on individual projects, and not be so scattergun about things. I mean, I know of artists who like to have several projects on the go. I don't have the bandwidth for that. I mean, I do have several ideas that I would like to see come to fruition, but you tend to dilute your energy if you're trying to spread yourself too thin. In answer to your question of what do I do? Do I study things? Do I train? Is that basically what you're asking? How do I develop certain skills?
Yes, because a few artists might just focus on developing their singing skills, dancing skills, and say, yeah, because that will come in handy. I don't actually have to focus that much on promoting myself, or I'll let my work speak for itself. But that doesn't
work at all, actually. And I know of a lot of stories, a lot of artists who have just come out of the Sydney Fringe Festival, had really lovely shows, but they don't have that balance of, okay, I've got a great show, now I need to be able to market it. I need to have a great flyer, a great brochure, or a wonderful poster. I need to be surrounded by people who, if I don't know what to do, to somehow enlist people who do know, so that my show is not, kind of sort of dying before it has a chance to attract people. So but I am just one person. I'm fortunate that I have some really great people in my life. Sarah Jane, wonderful director. She's actually an actor, but I've known her for a long time, and I knew that she'd be amazing at helping me with my show and directing my performance and my content. And then Joe, who you met, I think. Yes, Joe.
Yes,
Joe is amazing. He's been my friend we've known each other for about 5 years now. And he's a natural producer, but he's also got a marketing background, as I do. So writing is who I am. Writing is my DNA. So I can write my content, I can write my scripts, I can write my books, I can write my own promotional material, because that's my training. I'm an advertising copywriter by profession. So I'm really fortunate like that. But you really have to compartmentalize all the skills, because when I'm writing and producing the things that I want to perform, it's a different form of writing, obviously, to writing to promote and sell my show.
We're also the host of Foundis,
yes,
a talk show,
yes,
that you created right after your father passed away.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Nowadays, you host Love Soul. Is that something you did because of that hunger for new stories?
Love Soul or Foundis?
Both.
So Foundis came to life because it was my homage and my tribute to my father. So my father passed away shortly before, or he passed in 2011. Foundis happened in 2012. I can't remember exactly, maybe a couple of years later. And that was my my way of dealing and coping with the loss of my father. So, and again, and it was an all-male panel show. And I just wanted to be around male energy because I just lost my dad, you know. But ever since then, I just have this thing of wanting to interview people and have conversations. And it's actually less of an interview. I don't like using the word interview when it comes to sitting down and capturing or gathering somebody's story, because I feel that it's more of a conversation and it's an intimate exchange of stories, really. And as I said in the show, suddenly your stories become mine and my stories become yours. And in that particular exchange, there is nothing more magical. I just love it. I love it so much. So yeah, Love Soul is another way for me to meet really interesting people. And if someone were to, you know, if I was interviewing you now, Geraldo, and people, you know, would look at you and go, oh, okay, so this is a guy, he's 40 years old, he's got great hair, he's got wonderful skin, he's got a really lovely smile, but is that all there is to him? And now suddenly we're talking, I'm asking you a whole series of questions, and this entirely different story comes out of you, and people are like, I did not expect that to come out of this guy, looking the way he does, sounding the way he does, right? And that's what organically seems to emerge when I have conversations with people, whether it be on Love Soul or on Elle. Yeah, so that's, I don't know if that made any sense.
Sure. And how do you keep on top of so many topics?
The key is not to have a script. People that come on my show, and you're welcome to as well, I think we'll have to organise that at some point. People that come on Love Soul, yeah, absolutely. People that come on Love Soul, they always ask, is there a short list of questions that you can send me so I can be prepared? And it's like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that, because that then for me, it removes that spontaneity and it removes that space for something unique and unexpected to emerge from that conversation. And every single time I have those conversations on air, it never fails me. They will say something and I'll be like, that came out of, you know, that came out of somewhere else. Just to give you an example, and I don't think Susan would mind this, a couple months ago, I had the great pleasure of having Susan Rogers, who on Love Soul. Now, Susan Rogers was Prince's original audio engineer, and she basically was there for Purple Rain. She was there for Sign of the Times, some of his biggest albums. And she's an incredibly intelligent woman. She's an academic. She's a professor of, and I'm going to get this wrong, but she's a psychoacoustic professor for Berkeley College. So she's super academic. She's in her, I want to say in her 60s now. So we were having this great conversation, and she's a wonderful storyteller, and as I said, incredibly articulate. And we were talking about Prince, and she started to describe what it was like working with him. She was, I think, a young girl. She was in her early 20s, and I think they were around the same age. So we're talking the 1970s, I think, going into the early 80s, just before Purple Rain, working these incredibly long hours. She basically gave up 4 or 5 years of her life to be on call for Prince around the clock. And she's describing what it was like to be in the studio with him. So he was on another level of existence, both in terms of how he interacted with the world and how he produced his music. And she kind of told the story of, he was a very magnetic personality and very attractive, and he would obviously magnetize all these beautiful women into his life. And she saw that. And in that moment where she's describing it, I felt like there was this little pocket of opportunity to say to her, to ask her, did you have a crush on Prince? Now, if I had written a short list of questions and sent that off to her and said, I'm going to ask you, did you have a crush on Prince? A, that might have put her off. B, that would have given the interview, coloured the interview something that in a way that would have been a bit confrontational, I think. I mean, she's a very, very self-possessed, very composed woman, and I don't think, it would have made the interview go bad, but it certainly would have changed the dynamic between us before we even had a chance to go on air, right? And so that's why I don't like to tell people what I'm going to ask, because I don't know where the conversation is going to go. So the way she was describing Prince, to me, at the back of my mind, which is going super fast when we're having a chat on air, and I'm thinking, hang on, this is actually going somewhere else. I'm going to jump on that. So you will never see me say, so what's your star sign, Geraldo? Great. And what's your favorite color? Wonderful. And how do you like to do your, it will never, I hate that kind of interviewing. And I see Australian presenters do it all the time, and it pisses me off because there's no intimacy there. And then it really is an interview. It's not a conversation, and there's no room for intimacy there. And so in that moment when I asked Susan Rogers, did you have a crush on Prince? And she said, well, yeah, I did. And then her vulnerability emerged, because she said something along the lines of, but I would never have had a chance with him. She didn't spell it out like that, but that was the implication. You could tell with the energy in her voice and the way she was telling the story. And I thought that was actually quite sad, because she's a beautiful woman. She may not have thought that it was sad at all, but again, that's something for the person listening to that interview to arrive at. And that's, I think, where the magic is, and where, you start to learn something a little bit more about the person.
And I feel, Phyllis, that you're such an authentic person, and that intentionally you are seeking, as you said, to know who you are, to learn more about people, but to know who you are intentionally. Is there an ultimate goal to that self-knowledge, or is it just a trip down this inward lane that leads to who knows?
Yeah, I don't think there's any real end goal, because the end goal is the end of life, really. I mean, I don't think that we can ever really stop learning about ourselves and learning about the world that we live in, and what our place is, what our place is in this world. So yeah, no, there's no goal. I don't, and it's exhausting to think about it, because I'll constantly be on this journey of discovery and self-discovery, and I do my very best to express what I'm learning when I'm brave enough in my writing, because it's not always easy to talk about things that are quite truthful.
And another question: do you see, in terms of legacy, or in terms of how your path is crossing this big old world with these 7 billion people, but do you think in terms of the influence you have on the world we are creating?
Do you,
do you think, or do you consider the path you are following in this life?
Yeah. Am I influencing the world, or am I influencing people around me, my sons? What do you mean?
Yes. But if that's something you take into consideration when you're choosing whatever you're going to do next.
Well, certainly as far as my sons are concerned, I know that the way that I am in the world, the way that I create my work, the way that I am with people, I know that that influences my son, because I see how I am sometimes through, with them. Like I'll say that again in a more articulate way. The way I live my life and the decisions that I make, both creatively and personally, I can see that imprint, if you will, in my sons. I can see it like in the way that they might say something, or the decisions that they make, or how they are with their friends, the things that they say. And I'm like, they got that from me, which is both exciting and a bit unnerving at the same time, because it's like, this is quite the responsibility, this whole parenting thing. Yeah.
But other than your sons, do you see your influence, whether it's on the Australian radio and TV and theatre history, or in Australian literature? Do you see, or do you think in those terms, or not really? It's more.
I don't. I think. The only thing I can say to you in that area is, I mean, I've got a big ego, but it's not so big that I would say I'm doing this because I want to influence the world. I'm doing this because I want to inspire more connection between disparate personalities, people who you would never imagine would come in, would sit in a dark room with strangers and suddenly connect together purely because of what stories I am telling. For instance, on the final night that I did the show, there was a woman who came up to me at the end, and she said, "It's very brave. You're telling these stories about, your father, your son's father." And I said, "Well, we look around us and we see a lot of so-called intact marriages, but they're not really that intact, are they?" And she went, "Yes, they're not that intact, are they?" And she was referring to herself. And from that perspective, I think some influence may have taken place that night, because she felt brave enough, safe enough, crazy enough, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, to tell me in that little tiny pocket of time that she's one of those women in one of those marriages that actually shouldn't be intact anymore. Now, what she chooses to do with that awareness is really not of my concern, but that's what, and at the risk of sounding really wanky, that's what art can do.
Yes. And so even if it's not intentional, it's we artists and everyone basically ends up influencing in a way or another.
Yeah, agreed.
And sometimes I think that the way the world is so crazy, if we strive for a positive influence, even if it's just, I'll try to remain positive, it's still an influence that will keep us afloat as humanity, I think.
Absolutely. I think we only ever really want to positively influence people. I don't wake up in the morning and think, how am I going to negatively influence someone today?
Amazing. I have one final question, which is something I ask all of my guests here on the Creative Ticket, which is, what makes you, you?
Wow. Okay. What makes me me? So many billions of things make me me. That's a glib response, but what makes me me is my hunger to know who I am. That's what makes me me. My acute self-awareness, which can sometimes feel quite uncomfortable because I question everything, and I'm a seeker, and I'm incredibly curious about life and people and love and what turns us on. And writing makes me me. Writing is what I do to make sense of the world, to make sense of my feelings, to make sense of the people around me, I guess. And it all just comes back to the one thing, that I just want to know. That's it. I'm just curious. I want to know the truth. And if the tables were turned here, Geraldo, and I was asking you things, I'd be firing all sorts of questions at you. Why, from the most banal, why is your hair so curly, to to what do you feel like when you're in love? Stuff like that, because I'm wildly curious and fascinated by people.
And that's a wonderful way to end the podcast, but also to inspire our listeners to become more and more wealthy with the same curiosity and the same intensity in which you engage in your relationships and in life in general.
Thank you, Geraldo. It's lovely. You're very lovely. You've got beautiful energy.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, for being here on The Creative Ticket. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
I did, absolutely. And you asked very insightful questions. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Creative Ticket podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to share this with your friends and family and subscribe so you can stay up to date with new episodes. Feel free to reach out to hello@pacificvideo.com.au for feedback and suggestions. We would love to hear from you. Take care